But tonight, we are going to talk about Darwinism. And usually when I think of like the approach that this book takes, they give three natural arguments for the existence of God, but the cosmological and teleological and the moral are separated by the chapters on Darwinism. So like when I approach this, I like to keep those arguments together and then come back around and talk about Darwinism. So if you see these teachings online, like in a list, this is where I don't go in the same order as the book, just so you know. But a lot of people think that science and Christianity are at odds with each other, but there are a lot of apologists who point out that it's actually not science and Christianity, it's naturalism and Christianity, and a lot of people are trying to wed a naturalistic worldview to science. And so Hugh has an interesting story. He's a guy that I've talked about recently, but he said that he toured a country once where 2% of the population were Christians, and being an astronomer, he visited the university, and he said it was really interesting when he was in the astronomy department, half of the people in that department were already Christians. And he said of the half that were not Christians, half of those were actively reading the Bible and investigating the claims of Christianity. And he said that when he went to the biology department, he didn't find a single Christian. And so even though this country was only 2% Christian, in astronomy they were half. But obviously it can't be science that's against Christianity, or you would never have scientists who are Christians. It has to be something else. Now I want to start off and say, even if evolution is true, Christianity still holds. A lot of people think that if you can prove Darwinism, then you've disproved Christianity. But there are Christians that believe in Darwinism. I know some Christians who are really actually pretty conservative in all of their beliefs, but they still hold to Darwinism. Now, I can hear my atheist friends now, if they were to hear me say that, they would probably say, see, he sees how good the argument is for Darwinism. He's starting to compromise. But actually, it's that I think the arguments for Christianity are even stronger. And even if the neo-Darwinian paradigm is correct, it doesn't say anything about any of the arguments that we've talked about in the past or will talk about in the future. And obviously, DNA is still information, biological information. You still have the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the resurrection, etc. But one of the things about this topic that's kind of annoying is Darwinism is such a big tent, and there are so many ways that people will go about defending Darwinism that it can almost drive you nuts, like memorizing all these little tiny details. I used to approach it that way. I remember studying something called the RNA world and just being like, I have no idea what this is about. Is anybody really going to try to defend Darwinism by using that? So for today, I'm going to just give you some general tips on how to approach this. We're not going to get into like a lot of detail. There will be some, but just some general tips, and then I'll show you some defeaters for Darwinism, and if we have time at the end, I'll give you what I think is the best argument for Darwinism and some arguments against that. So I'm sure that most, if not all of you, are like me, a product of the public school system. So you probably studied Darwinism in class. So does anyone remember anything that stuck out to them when you were studying these things? Anything that you remember about biology?
The finches. There's like 2 different finches on that island. I can't remember.
Okay, yeah.
They were different colors or something. Remember that?
Yeah, we'll talk about that.
I always remember they would try to present things as the missing link. And they had like a knuckle bone, and they would make all sorts of assumptions about what kind of organism it was based on one little tiny thing. It was aggravated.
Yeah. It's like, how do you get that idea from like this piece of information? Okay.
Remember the monkey, the caveman, the human shark?
Yeah. Like starts out as like a little humanoid creature up to man. You
Yeah,
were,
do you remember anything, Joe?
that was probably before Darwin, wasn't it?
Yeah, pretty much so. Yeah.
Did they teach creation?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if they taught it. I think they just assumed everybody believed in creation.
Okay, that's good. Anything else before we move on? Well, even though evolution doesn't discount Christianity, I still think that there are good reasons to be skeptical. And my first little tip for you, whenever you talk about this, or even just like listening to something on TV or overhearing someone talking to someone else, the first thing you should always ask is it really an argument? Because it's been my experience that a lot of times when people first find out that maybe you don't believe in Darwin, or they're talking about someone that doesn't believe in Darwinism, they actually just kind of like try to make you feel stupid. Maybe there's some name calling. Usually you'll hear something like this that we have on the board, like, you're just one of those closed-minded anti-science Christians. Now, that doesn't really actually prove anything. And I was pretty young when I found out that closed-minded just means like you disagree with me and I don't like it. But even in studying this, I was kind of shocked to find some things. In a book by Henry Morris says there are great benefits to be derived for both student and teacher from a sound exposition of the creation model along with the evolution model. It is strange and disturbing that resistance is encountered from so many scientists and teachers to a proposal which is so reasonable and sultry. Now, if you don't know who Henry Morris is, he is kind of like the Ken Ham of the 1970s. Like young Earth, global flood, creationist. And what he's saying is, I think students should learn about evolution, but they should also learn about creation. And I know, like, when I think of our kids, my kids, when they go to biology class, I would like them to know more about evolution than anybody else in the class. I want them to be prepared. So, a lot of times you will hear something like, if you don't believe in evolution, then that's not science. Or you're not a scientist, so what makes you think that you can comment on these topics? Now, I almost guarantee that if you're actually talking to someone, they're probably not a scientist themselves. And if we could only talk about things that were our own discipline or something that we did as a job or something like that, then we wouldn't be able to talk about pretty much anything. A lot of people say all smart people believe it, or you have never had a real science class. That one I think is kind of funny because, you know, this stuff is hammered in middle school, elementary school, and have you ever noticed, like, when you go to college, you have to retake all those classes again? It's very strange. They don't do that in every single country. But I remember in college, even in the non-scientific classes, hearing things about evolution. Even in my sword fighting class, like, he would explain things like, oh, you're reacting that way because you've evolved over all these millions and millions of years, etc. There is a really cool book by Philip Johnson called Darwin on Trial. There's also a more popular level version of this. But this is a pretty cool book because Philip Johnson says in the very beginning, I'm not a scientist, but I taught law at Berkeley, and I've spent decades perfecting my baloney detector. And he goes at Darwinism from a lawyer's point of view and looks at it, picking out certain things like in the logic that don't necessarily follow. I'm not totally going to follow his book for this, but there are some pretty good logical fallacies that you can point out in the way people kind of reason about this stuff. So I've actually heard someone say all scientists believe it to be true. Like if I've asked somebody, what do you think is the best argument for Darwinian evolution? And the problem with that is just an appeal to the majority. You can't base truth on the number of people who believe it. And not only that, but that's not even a true statement. There is a list of people, and it's called a scientific dissent from Darwinism. And these are people with PhDs who pretty much all they have to agree on is we are skeptical of the claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged. And these could be anybody. I mean, you don't even necessarily have to believe in God. Could be that some of these people are just atheists who don't think that neo-Darwinism has enough to explain the origin of life. Sometimes people will come back and they'll say, all true scientists believe that evolution is true. And this is also a logical fallacy called the no true Scotsman fallacy. What they're saying is, only true scientists believe it. But how can you know who the true scientists are? Those are the ones who believe in Darwinism. So it's kind of like circular reasoning. And I bet that if you walk down the street and found 100 people that believe in Darwinism, the majority of the responses would not be scientific, which there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but I would bet money that the number one response would be all scientists believe it. Now, my second tip is even more important. You should watch for changing language. Get it? Changing. We're talking about evolution. Okay? Because I'm a teacher, I have access to a lot of science textbooks, and I just went to the science department and said, what can you give me that I can take back to my room? And one of the teachers loaded me up with a giant stack of books. And I flipped through some of those, and I just went to the glossary to look up what is their definition of evolution. And in Biology of the Dynamics of Life, I got this first one, which is gradual change in a species through adaptation over time. And I was actually shocked. That was the only definition that they gave in that textbook. And really, I mean, I don't see too much wrong with that. I think I agree with that. And the Bible might actually even teach that. But then I looked in another book called Modern Biology, and the definition that they gave was all the changes that have formed life on Earth from the earliest beginnings to the diversity that characterizes it today. Now, that's really different. That's a different definition, don't you think? Another way that you could say that is universal common descent of all life on Earth. Some people go even farther. Richard Dawkins in The Blind Watchmaker says natural selection, the blind unconscious automatic process which Darwin discovered, which we now know, is the explanation for the existence of an apparently purposeful form of all life, has no purpose in mind. It has no mind and no mind's eye. Now, as a Christian, you wouldn't be able to accept that definition because by definition that excludes a God. But you see this when people argue about evolution. They will sometimes use different definitions. And our book says one of the best things that you can do when talking about this issue, if someone ever says, do you believe in evolution? You should say, what do you mean by that? And one time my wife and I had like a 4-hour discussion with an atheist, and he actually said this to us. He said, all life evolved from a common ancestor. Don't you know that bacteria can evolve resistance to antibiotics? See, Darwin was right. Now, what definition is he using in that statement?
Both?
Yes, he's using both. So the all life evolved, that would be universal common descent. But then to prove that, he points to something that you can see, which is gradual change within a species. And the book differentiates this between micro and macro evolution. So micro, think of microscope, small, changes within kinds. And on page 142, you see this picture. They give the example of dogs. There are many different dogs, but it's the same kind of animal. On the other hand, macro evolution would be changes from one kind to another. In other words, single-celled organism all the way up to human beings. And that's the picture that you see on the right. Now, if you can differentiate between these two, and you can notice when people switch the definition, this can actually get you pretty far on the popular level. Because a lot of examples that people use for, that you can observe evolution are actually the micro level. So if you go back to the bacteria example, it's almost like they want to say because bacteria can develop this resistance to antibiotics, then that proves Darwin's theory. But you can actually go to the Creation Museum, and they will have an exhibit, like a little plaque on the wall that talks about how bacteria can develop resistance to antibiotics. The organism starts out as a bacteria or a bacterium before the change, and then after the change, it is still the same organism. It's almost like, have you seen a sleight of hand card trick? Maybe Ryan can do some card tricks for us later. Think of that, but with language. It's like they start with a certain definition and they flip it later on. A good way to think about microevolution is to always ask, what was the organism before the change? What was the organism after the change? If the answer to those two questions is the same, it is a micro example. So I've got some examples for us. They're not all micro. Let's see if we can figure this out. So Ryan mentioned Darwin's finches. The idea behind this was Darwin went to the Galapagos Islands and he saw that there were probably what many think were 13 species of finches that could not breed with one another. So that would make them distinct. They had different beaks. And during a drought, seeds were harder to crack. So finches with bigger beaks tended to survive because they, even if they could just open their mouth a fraction of a millimeter more, they were more suited for survival. So during the drought, the smaller finch beak, the population with the smaller beak died out, and the larger beaks were retained. Now, would this be an example of microevolution or macro?
Micro.
Why do you say that?
These are still finches.
Because it's a finch before the change and a finch after the change. But actually, it's even better for us because what they don't tell you in the science textbooks is when the drought was over and the rains came back, the population reverted back to large beak finches and small beak finches. So the whole idea with this was, see, look at what can happen over just a few decades in these populations. Now extrapolate that back millions and millions of years, you're going to have totally different animals. But the microevolution in this example is actually cyclical. And they observed this again in the 70s and 80s. When the droughts came, the finch beaks in the populations were bigger. And when the rains came back, it reverted back. So you get these cycles over and over and over again. I heard a good analogy of this. It's like if it snows 1 inch every week in January, you can't sit back and say, by next year, we're going to have 48 inches of snow because the snow's going to melt in the summertime. It's kind of the same way with these evolutionary changes. And not only that, but those 13 finch species that he observed, many people have seen some evidence that those are starting to interbreed together. And so there might actually only be 2 or 3 distinct species. But even so, the Bible talks about God making animals after their kind. So even young Earth creationists believe that there is some room for change within species or within kinds. I'm sure you saw this in your textbooks. The peppered moth is an example that's usually given. When the Industrial Revolution happened in England, the trees were more sooty, so the darker peppered moths became more abundant because the lighter ones were easier for the birds to eat. So would this be micro or macro?
Micro.
Micro, because it's still a moth. Very good.
Is that even strictly evolution, though, or is that just changing demographics within a population?
Well, that's the point. If evolution is just change over time, then that technically counts as evolution. But that's why you differentiate between micro and macro. So microevolution would be change within the population. And there's also some controversy with that too, because I guess peppered moths don't really live on tree trunks, because if they do, they'll get eaten. So like those pictures were staged anyway. Even though I think the general idea is true, like the population shifted back and forth, but it would be on the micro level.
But did that answer your question? Like, is it considered evolution if it's not actually like there's dark moths and there's light moths? Neither one of them are changing. It's just the quantity of each is changing. So it's still considered evolution.
It depends on your definition,
Okay.
but yes, that would be microevolution. So that would be the definition given in that first book, but not in the definition given in the second. So my entire point here is you've got to keep the definition consistent. because they're showing you something that you can observe, and that is a kind of evolution, but then they're extrapolating it back to something that you can't observe. Like, by definition, you cannot observe something over millions of years. But that's a different definition. Helpful? What about this one? Archaeopteryx. It was thought that this was the missing link between reptiles and birds. So you've got reptiles with scales, and then you've got Archaeopteryx in the middle, and then you've got birds on the other side. So that would be an example of what?
That would be macro.
That would be macro. So you'd have to come at this a little bit differently. Now, to my knowledge, either it's very suspect that this is even a missing link, or people have abandoned that altogether and just said, like, this is a distinct species. But even if this is still thought to be a missing link, you didn't observe it change from reptile to Archaeopteryx to bird. It can't be observed. And also, sometimes people reference fruit flies, like they've bred fruit flies in the lab to have an extra set of wings. Again, this would be micro because it's a fruit fly before it has the extra set. It doesn't change into a different kind of animal. There's a couple problems with this. These experiments were intelligently designed, so that kind of seems like a philosophical contradiction there. But the fruit flies that have an extra set of wings, those wings are actually paralyzed. They can't fly farther, they can't fly faster, they probably can't even fly. Somebody gave the analogy of building a jet with an extra set of wings that just kind of hang down from large cables. That jet's not going to go anywhere. So they have bred these fruit flies, but they would never survive in the wild. Sometimes people give the example of dogs. We have bred dogs, so there are many, many, many different dog breeds out there. But obviously, before you breed a dog, it's a dog. After you breed it, it's still a dog. The genetics within those animals, it's the same kind of animal. And this is not natural selection. This is guided by mind. After all, that ain't natural. Poodles are not natural, people. And even after hundreds and hundreds of years of breeding, you get to the limits where you can't go on any further. This poodle's not going to change into like a horse or anything like that. And not only that, but you're actually removing genetic material. So that's why a lot of pure breed dogs have so many health problems, because they've been winnowed down over these centuries. And actually, the most genetically diverse dog is probably that mutt running around in the street. And if all the pure breeds got out and just roamed the street for 6 months, we'd be back to just those mutts, those wild dogs. We wouldn't have any more pure breeds. Now you might be thinking, is it really this easy? Like, yeah, you just look at the word, make sure it doesn't change. But in 2004, National Geographic had a cover story, Was Darwin Wrong? And I can remember the exact place where I was sitting when I saw this for the first time. I was in the suburbs of Chicago, and I thought, this is going to be great. They're finally going to address the problems with this theory. And my hopes were dashed because there was a resounding no, of course. The evidence for evolution is overwhelming. But look at some of the examples that they give in here. Dogs. Finches. Bacteria. This last little bit is kind of near and dear to my heart because they talk about how evolution touches you and how, you know, if you don't believe in evolution, you kind of like can't do science. And so I think they're kind of implying that if you don't believe in evolution, not only are you wrong, but you might be dangerous. Maybe I'm reading too much into that. I don't know. I'll ask my wife later. So, as I said before, if you take what you can see and you try to use that to prove what you can't see, not only do you change the definition, but really, Darwinism is not a pure science in the sense of like, if I told you that water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius at 1 atmospheric pressure, whatever it is, and it has to be pure, like we could actually go to a place, take a substance, change its temperature, and you would see that it becomes solid at that temperature. You can't do that with evolution because, as I said, you'd have to live for millions and millions of years. But you might be thinking, well, what about the things that you can see? And in this case, it would be the fossil record. And the fossil record is near and dear to my heart for reasons we will see shortly. But I think a lot of people have a false view of the fossil record, and that brings me to my third tip, which is always ask, what's the evidence? You shouldn't be afraid of these things. And I think a lot of people, when they think of the fossil record, they think of all these perfectly preserved organisms that just kind of follow Darwin's tree of life. And the further down you go in the rock layer, you can just point to it in the illustration, and it's like Darwin's tree of life in limestone. But the reason that I even bring this up and that I like this example is, a few years ago, I used to study apologetics every Thursday morning with Joey. But it was pretty cool. Sometimes, like, I would just teach him stuff, or sometimes we would just pick a class, and then we would watch these classes throughout the week. And we did John Rittenhouse's apologetics class out at Biola, and that was really nice because we'd watch the videos by ourselves, we'd take notes, and then we'd come together and kind of compare, like, what did you think was really interesting? Oh, I thought that too. Let's talk about that a little more. And Rittenhouse goes through a critique of evolution, and so my boy Joey took that information out to other students, and he would kind of dialogue with them and then come back and tell me what they said in response. And he was talking to one of his atheist friends about the evolution talk, and his friend said, well, evolution is true because it's so apparent in the fossil record. And I didn't really know a whole lot about the fossil record, but I was like, we should look into this. But at the time I was like, I wonder what we're going to find. Like, maybe this is going to be something that we'll really have to deal with. But I can tell you, after studying it myself, I am actually more skeptical of Darwinism after doing what this atheist kid told us to do. And to illustrate this, I don't even need to quote anybody but atheists. So to set this up, there is a lot of disagreement with the fossil record. So much so that in the 1970s, two men, Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould, came up with a theory called punctuated equilibrium. And this is the idea that species don't change gradually from one kind to another, but instead they remain static with little or no evolutionary change. And then after a while, the evolutionary change does occur on the macro level, but when it does, it is so rapid that it can't be explicitly recorded in the fossil record. Now think about what they're admitting there. They're saying gradual evolution is not seen in the fossil record, so we have to come up with a new theory. And as you can imagine, this caused somewhat of a stir. And in Richard Dawkins's The Blind Watchmaker, which I have here if you'd like to check out later, he devotes a good portion of this just to addressing Eldredge and Gould's theory. And again, after reading Dawkins, I'm even more skeptical. So see what he admits here. He says, from Darwin onwards, evolutionists have realized that if we arrange all the available fossils in chronological order, they do not form a smooth sequence of scarcely perceptible change. Now, the italicized words are his, but the underlining is mine. We can, to be sure, discern long-term trends of change. Now, notice the examples that he gives us here. Legs get progressively longer. Skulls get progressively more bulbous, and so on. So those are micro examples. But the trends as seen in the fossil record are usually jerky, not smooth. Darwin and most others following him have assumed that this is mainly because the fossil record is imperfect. Darwin's view was that a complete fossil record, if only we had one, would show gentle rather than jerky change. But since fossilization is such a chancy business, and finding such fossils as there are is scarcely less chancy, that's kind of an awkward sentence, but that is how it appears in the book, it is as though we had a cine film with most of its frames missing. Now, Richard Dawkins is English, and I think that word cine is like a Britishism, but I even ran that by one of my British acquaintances, And even he said, like, that's a little archaic, but I think I'm pronouncing that right. It just means a movie. We can, to be sure, see movement of a kind when we project our film of fossils, but it is more jerky than Charlie Chaplin. For even the oldest and scratchiest Charlie Chaplin film hasn't completely lost 9/10 of its frame. Now, he sees that the fossil record does not support evolution, but his kind of defense mechanism for this is to say that, well, the fossil record must just be incomplete. Now, it is pretty chancy to find fossils, or to have fossils, so he's not totally wrong, but he's admitting that the fossil record is a problem, because you don't see what you would think. The American paleontologists Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould, when they first proposed their theory of punctuated equilibria in 1972, made what has since been represented as a very difficult suggestion. They suggested that actually the fossil record may not be as imperfect as we thought. Maybe the gaps are a true reflection of what really happened rather than being an annoying but inevitable consequence of an imperfect fossil record. Maybe, they suggested, evolution really did in some sense go in sudden bursts, punctuating long periods of stasis with no evolutionary change, when no evolutionary change took place in a given lineage. National Geographic was less optimistic. Illuminating but spotty, the fossil record is like a film of evolution from which 999 of every 1,000 frames have been lost on the cutting room floor. I think when people hear that we are skeptical of this, they think we're conspiracy theorists. But I think that it is good to have a healthy skepticism of everything. Here's a great example on the fossil record. Always ask, what's the evidence? This is a picture of Nebraska man. As you can see, they thought it was a missing link. They look like people, but they also look different. They're using tools, but they got long hair and weird lips. There's like camels in the background. This entire artist rendition of the Nebraska man was put together based on this, a single tooth. And that is not 3 teeth, that is 1 tooth from 3 different angles. This blew up as a missing link. 5 years later, it was retracted because that turned out to be a pig's tooth. Now, I don't know a whole lot about the history behind this, but I can almost guarantee you that the sensationalism behind the unveiling of Nebraska Man probably dwarfed the retraction. And I do wonder how many people went to their graves believing in Nebraska Man because they saw this picture. Now, I'm not saying that every missing link is an embarrassment like Nebraska Man. I'm not saying every missing link is a fraud like Piltdown Man was. But it is good to say, okay, what did you find that you used to come up with this idea of the missing link? Sometimes it is just a skull cap. That's all we have of this supposed missing link. Even if we could find a full skeleton of a humanoid creature that wasn't a chimp, wasn't a human, it still wouldn't necessarily prove evolution. You know, I think Lucy there on the left, she's like 40% intact. But you didn't see it happen. And in fact, something like 99% of an organism's information, like what you can know about an organism, is in its soft tissue anyway.
Is that all they have of Lucy?
That picture?
Yeah.
Yes, but that is a couple hundred bone fragments. 40% complete?
I mean, I remember that being a big deal,
Yeah.
but I don't remember. Like, the picture I remember was like they like redid what they think that she would look like. I don't think I've ever seen that.
Yeah. I mean, I think she's pretty complete as far as skeletons go.
But you said there's only 40%.
Yeah, but I mean, like I said, sometimes I just find a little skull cap or a tooth. Now, technically, I haven't given you a reason to doubt evolution at this point. You know, the fossil record is good for us, but you can't just say, okay, well, the fossil record is what it is, so that means our view is true. So I'll give you 3 reasons to doubt evolution, 3 ways that you can kind of come against this idea. The first is an idea known as irreducible complexity. This was made famous by a guy named Michael Behe in his book, Darwin's Black Box. The idea behind this is there are some things in nature that are very complex, but they're made out of multiple parts. And each part is useless without every other part in place. And so he says, think of a mousetrap. You've got the platform, there's 5 pieces. You've got the platform, you got the hammer that kills a mouse, you've got the hold down bar, you've got the catch, and you've got the spring. Now, if you take out any one of these, the mousetrap doesn't work. And he said there are things in nature that are like this. And probably the most common example is the bacterial flagellum. It's basically like a tiny motor. And the idea here is you can't just say that this evolved piece by piece. The entire thing has to be there. And I have a little movie, because I like animations, that'll kind of show you this. Maybe.
In Darwin's Black Box in 1996, Behe spotlighted and made famous a number of really interesting discoveries that had been occurring in biochemistry and cell biology over the last 2 or 3 decades. And what biologists, molecular biologists, cell biologists, microbiologists have been discovering is that at the level of individual cells, there are little tiny examples of nanotechnology, little tiny machines at work. The flagellar motor is the one that Behe made most famous. It's a rotary engine that powers a whip-like tail, a protein tail that functions like a propeller, and it moves the bacterium through liquid, enabling the bacterium to essentially track down its food supply. And this little machine includes a rotor, a stator, a drive shaft, a U-joint, bushings, bearings, and a whip-like tail that functions like a propeller. And the machine in some bacterial systems turns at 100,000 RPMs in one direction and can reverse direction on a quarter of a turn and turn 100,000 RPM in the other direction.
Bacterial flagellum is a true nanomachine, about 40 nanometers in size. It's amazing. I mean, E. coli, salmonella, which are kind of our model systems for the bacterial flagellum, can propel a cell about 20 lengths per second through a very viscous medium, like water, to these organisms. And you extrapolate that to human scale. 20 body lengths per second, 6-foot person, you know, times 20, 120 feet per second. Mark Spitz or Phelps would be setting records with this type of propulsion.
It's hardwired into a signal transduction circuit that allows the bacterium to sense changes in the sugar gradient in the surrounding liquid.
This signal transduction system is actually a short-term memory system where the cell is, if it's going in the direction of an attractant, a nutrient that it can use to metabolize, it follows that chemical gradient. If it's a repellent, it will sense that and move in the opposite direction. So it's more than just this engine.
It's an extraordinary piece of nanotechnology. It's high tech in low life. And so just by spotlighting these extraordinary pieces of nanotechnology inside cells, and the flagellar motor wasn't the only one by any means, Behe, in a sense, opened up a window for people. He opened up the black box of the inner workings of the cell and said, look, this is much more complex than anything that the early evolutionary biologists had envisioned. Darwin knew nothing of this type of nanotechnology in cells, and at the very least, we've got to come up with an explanation for this.
So the idea isn't that this is complex, therefore it couldn't have evolved. It's that this is complex in a way where, like I said, every piece needs to be there. You can't have part of it for millions and millions of years. Now, some Darwinists have come back and said, well, maybe those parts could have been used for something else. And just kind of Googling around, I found a guy who's one of Behe's major critics. And he literally said, Behe doesn't have enough imagination. thought that was interesting. I mean, this settled scientific theory, like you need a lot of imagination to make it work. I know some people have said the same thing about the eye. The eye is irreducibly complex. And someone posed the question, what good is 5% of an eye over millions of years? And Richard Dawkins came back and said, well, 5% vision is better than no vision at all. But the problem with that is, just because you have 5% of an eye, that doesn't mean that you have 5% vision. I could take a knife and go into your eyeball, and especially if we're talking about the optic nerve, I could cut out a little slice that would just be 1% of your total eye. But you wouldn't retain 99% of your vision. It doesn't make any sense. So this is a pretty cool argument. Another non-scientific argument that is really cool, but really abstract and difficult for me to even wrap my head around, is the idea that if evolution is true and there's no God directing it, then you can't trust your mind to give you truth about the world, including truth about evolution. If your brain has just evolved for you to survive, the truth or falsehood of your beliefs have nothing to do with that. It's kind of far out. But it's my understanding that this has had some real traction, especially like in the philosophical world. You can have evolution, but you can't have evolution and naturalism. There has to be something guiding it. Alvin Plantinga is a guy who's really done a lot of work in this. I had a video of his, but Alvin Plantinga is like William Lane Craig's hero, and like half the time people can't even understand what William Lane Craig is saying. And I have a Friday coffee group that I kind of experiment on with these teachings, and they were not into it, so I just decided not even to bother. But I will put that in the resources. It's kind of interesting. This last one is where I think the money is, and this is that little handout I gave you. We're actually going to go through this together. This is the probability argument. So if you want to read along, I'll start here. 16 steps to generating advanced life. 16 steps punctuate the history of life on Earth. Each of these steps is critical for making possible the entry of advanced life. The likelihood of all of these steps occurring from a naturalistic perspective is essentially zero. This zero probability does not take into account either life's origin or the origin of the mind and the human spirit. So evolution doesn't have anything to do with the arrival of the species, it's the survival of the species. Why does the history of life appear the way it does? Naturalists, materialists, deists, and most theistic evolutionists would answer that the chemicals on the early Earth spontaneously self-assembled into a simple cell that was able to reproduce. From there, the cell's daughters evolved to produce all the life forms that have ever existed throughout the past 3.8 billion years. Such a history requires that life make at least 16 transitional steps in order to generate advanced life forms. So some people sat down and they said, in order for evolution to work, what is the bare minimum amount of things that you would need? And they came up with this list of at least 16. There could be more. Now, we don't need to go through all these, but cells consisting of only a few hundred gene products must transition to cells containing several thousand gene products. Respiration systems must go from anaerobic to aerobic. Cells must develop nuclei, mitochondria, transition from free-floating to colony life. These are the things that had to take place. Minuscule probabilities. That's quite a list for undirected natural processes to complete. Evolutionary biologist Francisco Ayala notes that from a Darwinian perspective, each step is highly improbable. Taking into account just a few of these steps, Ayala determined that the probability of intelligent life arising from bacteria to be less than 1 chance in 10 to the millionth power. Now, Francisco Ayala is a Spanish evolutionary biologist, not a friend to design. And even he sees, just for some of these things, 1 chance in 10 to the millionth power. That is a 1 with a million zeros behind it. There is only 10 to the 80th atoms in the universe. Okay, so we're talking about a probability that we cannot even fathom. Physicists John Barrow, Brandon Carter, and Frank Tipler calculated the probability of all 16 steps occurring to be less than 1 chance in 10 to the 24 million. To get a feel for how minuscule this probability is, it is roughly equivalent to someone winning the California lottery 3 million consecutive times, where the individual purchases just one lottery ticket each time. Realistically, the probability is indistinguishable from someone winning the California lottery 3 million consecutive times, where the individual purchases no tickets at all. 3 million jackpots in a row, don't even need to buy a ticket. There's a better chance that that will happen to you than that you evolved from a single-celled organism. Their probability determination also fails to consider that no naturalistic explanation for the origin of physical life exists. Naturalistic explanations aren't even possible. All naturalistic models for life's origin require a supply of building block molecules and time for those building block molecules to self-assemble. Yet overwhelming evidence now demonstrates that neither the time nor the building blocks were present for the origin of life on Earth. Even if the Earth is 4 billion years old, that is still not enough time to get evolution. Moreover, the 16 steps imply that no category of life has permanently disappeared, in spite of the fact that mass extinctions have occurred throughout life's history. The steps are additions to life, not replacements. If life appeared on Earth without a plan, purpose, or goal, then why have all the categories remained? It makes better sense that the Creator would act to ensure that no category of life permanently disappears. A Creator could intend that all life fulfill a role in equipping humanity to carry out our purpose and destiny. Psalm 104:24 provides an apt two-sentence summary of the origin of life and the 16 steps. How many are your works, O Lord? In wisdom you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. The reason I really like this argument, in my opinion, very simple to understand. A lot simpler even than those other two arguments that I gave you. You don't have to get bogged down in all the little scientific details. If you just remember that California lottery thing, and that there are 16 steps, and that even the non-believers would agree that these 16 steps are improbable, you could use this tomorrow if someone asked you. It is my goal to memorize all 16 of those steps, and then I'll be really dangerous. But I don't know, I think that's really cool, don't you? What is the best argument for evolution? I think it is this, and this appears in the book. The DNA between apes and humans seems to be somewhere between 80 to over 90% similar. Darwinists would say this implies a common ancestor. So Darwin predicted, chimpanzees and humans are going to be really close to each other on that tree. So how do we deal with this? This is something that I would like to look into a little bit more. But the book says this takes into account the fact that DNA is information. Information always comes from a mind, so you can't get past that argument. Geisler and Turk say it could be evidence for a common ancestor, but it could also be evidence for a common creator or designer, because maybe you would need a common code in order to live in the same biosphere. If everything had totally different DNA, they might be so different that they wouldn't survive on this planet. There's also reason to believe that a food chain needs common biochemistry. You wouldn't be able to eat anything if it didn't share some of the same DNA. They also point out, you can take these two sentences. Darwin was a scientific god. Darwin was a scientific dog. The information in those two sentences is very different, even though it has all the same letters and almost all the same order. And that was the first thing that I thought when I first came upon this. It's like, what do you mean by 80 to 90%? I mean, if you take a bunch of the same letters, I'm sure a lot of books are very similar if you tally up all the letters, but the information in those books is different. Geisler and Turk give kind of an interesting example. I don't know what I think about this, but they say, think about it. The teaspoon, the pot, and the kettle, if they're all made out of steel, they're all made out of 100% the same stuff. They're very similar to each other, but you can't say that one came out of the other because they could have had a common designer. I don't know. What do you think? Any thoughts?
record.
Mhm.
So I was wondering if you've heard any argument regarding hybrids. And the example that I thought of was if you have horses and you have donkeys, you can combine them to make mules. If you have 100 donkey skeletons and 100 horse skeletons, and you find one mule skeleton, then maybe you think that that's the missing link. Like, have you heard any information in that area, like, to maybe why something seemed like a link when maybe they're just a one-off?
Sure. That is really interesting. I've never heard that before. I thought where you were going with that was a little bit different, because that is kind of an interesting thing in the animal kingdom, that you can get a mule, but mules are always sterile,
Right,
so you can't go any further than that.
right.
But I see what you're saying. I mean, a mule and a donkey and a horse are all different. So maybe some of these quote-unquote missing links. I mean, for one thing, it's not a missing link. It's a missing chain. Like, we don't have the whole chain of, like that picture that you mentioned earlier about like the nice little progression. That looks really great in like the artist's rendition, but it's not like that in the fossil record. But yeah, that's an interesting point. Who's to say that some of these similarities aren't just hybrids? And then finally, another cool book. This is Icons of Evolution by Jonathan Wells. This is that guy I told you about a while back. He's not a Christian, but he's referenced a lot in apologetic circles. He's a follower of Some Young Moon, which is a guy. That's not the moon. But this book is pretty cool. He goes through, I think it's 10 icons of evolution, which are things that we've known that there have been problems with these things for decades and decades and decades, but they still end up in science textbooks. So like the finches are in here, the four-winged fruit fly, from ape to human, Archaeopteryx, Haeckel's embryos, the Miller-Urey experiment. And he said one of the most interesting things about this book is it actually doesn't refute evolution. It just says if you're going to teach evolution, don't put things in science textbooks that we know are a lie. And he said he got so much hate from the Darwinists for publishing this view, or for publishing this book. He said it was actually kind of funny. But that's a good one.